we certainly still have some time to reduce emissions and possibly over the coming decades to bring greenhouse gas concentrations down. And if we do, the glaciers will survive.
You are about to hear a podcast by the Center for Advanced Study at the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. In this episode, we talk with Professor Ben Orlov, a social anthropologist from Columbia University. He talks about the central roles glaciers play for many humans all over the world and why it's a tragedy that they are all disappearing. Thank you for listening.
What is it about glaciers that make you so excited?
Well, there are several different things about glaciers that make me excited. They're simply beautiful, magnificent. It's extraordinary to see this world of ice on top of mountains. So just the form of glaciers, their immediate presence, what it's like to listen to the water as it percolates under the ice, or what it's like to see the huge masses, the complex structure of cracks on their surfaces. The glaciers themselves are amazing. There's also the fact that they're found around the world. There are glaciers on every continent. If you look at this map, you'll see that there are glaciers in Europe and Asia, North and South America. The glaciers, which are not so small on a few mountains in Africa, don't show up on this map, but they're there. And if you count New Zealand as part of Australia, even Australia-New Zealand has their glaciers. So they're found everywhere. And the third thing is that they're changing everywhere, and they're changing in the same way. They're melting, they're shrinking. They're not all going to vanish in the next few decades. There'll be some ice on the highest mountains, probably for centuries to come. But they are disappearing, and that raises the question of what can we do about it? What does it mean to the people who live close to the glaciers? What does it mean to the people who live further downstream in the river valleys where the water largely comes from glaciers?
Yeah. Okay, so we'll get back to that, the consequences and what this means. But before we do that, can you briefly explain to us what glaciers are?
So glaciers are water. They're really nothing more and nothing less than water. This substance that forms our bodies, that covers most of our planet's surface, that takes many different forms. When snow falls on lower mountains, falls in the winter and it melts in the spring and summer. But when it falls on tall mountains, it doesn't melt. It never gets warm enough for all the snow to melt. The snow gets thicker and thicker, and the pressure of the thick snow converts the snow to ice. And then the ice slowly starts to flow downstream. You think of ice as a solid, but it actually can move, particularly when it's on steep slopes. So this ice will accumulate till it starts to move downslope, till it gets to some place warm enough for it to melt. So you have the water falling on the top of the mountain as snow, becoming ice, and then moving down the mountain, either reaching the ocean or melting. So that's the whole process of water actually flowing through the glacier in terms of the slowly moving ice. Sometimes the glaciers grow larger if there's a lot of snow, but in recent decades, the melting has been much faster than the formation of the ice, so the glaciers are getting smaller. If you look at this diagram over here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you'll see that of the glacier regions, there are 19 of them around the world. There are declines in all of them. So yes, there are a few glaciers that are growing longer, but by and large, it's a uniform process of shrinking, faster in some places, slower in others, but the trend is always in the same direction, and that's due to temperature. That's due to the warming that takes place because of the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases.
What has changed? As you said, they're shrinking, they're melting, but...
Certainly the glaciers differ. The glaciers here in Norway are what people call fast glaciers because they get a great deal of snow falling in the winter, rapid ice formation, rapid ice movement. It's also not so cold here in the winter. You may be surprised to hear that, but in comparison to in the high Himalayas, it's much colder. There are places, some of them in parts of Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, some places in Canada, where there are slower glaciers, where there's less accumulation, but also less melting. So the physical processes of the glaciers do differ. How steep the mountain is, what is the rocky bottom that they're in contact with. These are questions that lead glaciologists, the scientists who study glaciers, to recognize that there are distinct manifestations of the similar basic processes. As I am a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist, so I study the human societies that live around the glaciers. So I'm very conscious of the questions of the rivers into which the glaciers flow. Who are the people who live there? Are these farmers who want water for irrigation? Are these societies that use hydropower to generate electricity? Sometimes there are floods when a great deal of water is released from a glacier. How do those affect people? And then I'm just interested in the meanings that people give to glaciers. How do they understand what a glacier is? What are their beliefs about the glaciers?
Yeah. And you have some specific examples of these different meanings that are put to glaciers that you could maybe talk more about. And also, as you say, you're an anthropologist and you've conducted research many different places in the world. So maybe you can just tell us more about that, more about the consequences that might already happen of the glaciers retreat, and also the consequences you might fear or people fear can come.
Yes, so these glacier floods attract a great deal of attention. Sometimes when a glacier melts, the water does not immediately flow into the river, but it's temporarily dammed by rock walls, which are formed by the glaciers themselves. These rock walls are called moraines. They will form lakes, but they're not very strong. So sometimes these rock walls break, release a great deal of water flowing downstream. So this has tremendous pressure. It can destroy entire villages. There's a question of how to prepare for this, how to establish warning systems. You can see here in this picture a very positive example of Bhutan of a solar-powered flood alarm. So this does not require any connection with the national grid. It just sits there and is connected to a sensor. And if a flood begins high in the mountains, it can send a warning. And it often could take as much as 10 or 20 hours for the floodwaters to reach the village. So that's enough time for people to evacuate, whether it happens at day or at night. That's certainly one important kind of consequence. There's also just the way that having the glaciers is tied to the sense that people have of themselves. I like the example of the country of Armenia, a small country in the Caucasus, which had been part of the Soviet Union for decades. And you can see here this image of the seal of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic that shows wheat and that shows grapes, indicating what an agricultural country it is. It has the classic imagery of the Soviet Union, the hammer and sickle, the red star. And it's got this one mountain there, Mount Ararat, and it shows that it has white on its peak. This is the mountain that's visible from the Armenian capital of Yerevan. It's located in Turkey now. It's close to the border, but it is within Turkey. And so for the Armenians, it's really a symbol of their homeland and of their people, their peoplehood. So if you look now at the seal of the Republic of Armenia, the post-Soviet Republic, founded in 1991, everything has changed. They've got some historic symbols that go back to the independent kingdoms of Armenia. They're immensely proud of those, showing their earlier nationhood. And there's maybe a bit of religious iconography. The one thing they continue to have is this mountain, the same mountain. That's the only thing that connects the communist and the independent period, is the mountain. This is who they are. People care about that. And you can see even these symbols from the city of Seattle in the United States, where the icon of the city is not just the skyline. They're very proud that they're a metropolis, and they have this very distinct building called the Sky Needle left over from the World's Fair that put them on the map. But they have to show Mount Rainier. And here's, in fact, a website, a Twitter account. People want to know, is the mountain visible in this area that has just about as much cloud and rain as Oslo, perhaps not quite as much as Bergen. You often can't see the mountains, so when you can see it, everyone's excited. It's a part of identity. Beyond that, it's even a part of religion. I've been fortunate to take part in a pilgrimage in the Peruvian Andes where villagers will hike many days, 3, 4, 5 days, camping out at night to approach this huge field where they sleep out for the privilege of climbing up onto the ice. You can see this picture of these men carrying a cross up to the ice. It's in a way a Christian symbol, but it's also a pre-Christian symbol, being united. And for them, it's tremendously important to travel here to show their devotion to the powers in the universe by undertaking this arduous climb. The ice that they can take is understood to be very powerful. They save the ice when it melts. They save the water. It's understood to cure illness. And it's very troubling for them to see the glacier shrinking. Partly it's more difficult for them to climb much higher now, but they worry about the mountain withdrawing the ice. Some of them think that they're not showing enough devotion, so the mountain is pulling back. I've actually heard conversations between them about whether the mountain is angry or the mountain is sad. And they have pretty much agreed that the mountain is sad. It's sad about the state of the world. And so for them, it's a troubling sign of the world being somehow just out of joint, going in a bad direction. Coldness is a powerful force in the world, not just in glaciers, but with the whole transformation of coldness. In the past, if people wanted to keep food cold, they had to have what we call in America an ice box. You had to have a box with a piece of ice that would have been harvested in a frozen pond. I imagine you had these in Norway as well. Whereas now we have electric refrigerators. There was a time when there were gas-based refrigerators. So those just seem like a convenience. We don't think very much about them. There's been a tremendous transformation of many regions around the world, though, with the development of refrigeration for the transportation of commodities. Argentina, Australia, the Western United States would not have had the development of cattle industries if it hadn't been for refrigeration, for the capacity to freeze meat. You would not have been able to ship many cattle from Australia, from Argentina to the cities of the world, but you can freeze entire carcasses and ship them. And refrigeration touches some of our most intimate aspects of our lives. The fact that we can have blood transfusions, that allows surgery. And that seems very positive, but it also is connected to warfare, where you would not have certain types of modern warfare if you couldn't bring blood to field hospitals. That requires refrigeration. The people who study this offers the example in vitro fertilization. Our notion of what it is to be a mother or a father, in a sense what it is to be a parent and to be a spouse, depends on the extension of reproduction to technology-assisted reproduction, and so in vitro fertilization is a key example. And the whole question of what to do about these frozen embryos, it's an enormous challenge in the United States, where one of the key issues that's being debated in my country's presidential elections are the rights of both women to their eggs, and then in a sense of men to the frozen embryos to which they have contributed sperm. But I think of ice in the environment. I think of the tremendous value of ice in glaciers for its slow release into rivers, often at very different seasons than when snow is melting in the mountains. The glacial meltwater flows through the same rivers as snow melts, but in different seasons, and sometimes in different years during times of drought. The glacial meltwater is what saves irrigation, allows hydropower to continue. So their loss is a tragedy. It's a tragedy to the people who have their identities linked to glaciers, as we've seen. So it's showing us the urgency of addressing greenhouse gases. We certainly still have some time to reduce emissions and possibly over the coming decades to bring greenhouse gas concentrations down. And if we do, the glaciers will survive.
All of this is cryopolitics,
Yes.
would you say? Yeah.
Yes.
And also, I guess the example that you showed us yesterday in your talk about the mining,
Yes.
where they cut in the glacier
Yes.
in order to do their mining.
Yes.
That's very political too, I guess.
Yes. So this is a question of glaciers are located in mountains. That's where it's coldest and where the ice forms. And so these are often places where there are deposits of minerals, valuable minerals. So does it make sense to say, well, the glacier is just like any other kind of rock or dirt we have to scrape away to get to the ore beneath? Do we care about glaciers because the water is more important than mere rock? Do we care about them because the glaciers really are just part of what makes the mountains so special? Some countries have passed glacier laws. Argentina, Austria, they prohibit these activities that damage glaciers. But as you see in this picture in Kyrgyzstan, here is a Canadian-owned gold mine. Centerra is the name of the corporation. Kumtor is the mine. And they are proud of their ability to use technology. Here's a big, some sort of backhoe scraping. You can see the enormous layers of ice that have been removed. And here's an enormous dump truck just taking the ice and putting it into a river. So the local villagers are very disturbed about this. They've seen other things that the mine has done. It's dumped toxic chemicals into their streams, but they're even more worried about the glacier. And so there have been demonstrations. It's a question of whether Kyrgyzstan will move in the direction of these other countries. Kyrgyzstan, it sounds so far away, so irrelevant, but it's part of Central Asia, a huge region where there are primarily dictatorships. It's an area of great ethnic rivalry, an area of potential instability, and protecting the glaciers, protecting the water is one of the ways to promote peace. We hear so much about Syria. A number of people know that the background to the conflict in Syria is in part due to drought. It's not due only to drought, but it is very much exacerbated by a drought that in turn can be linked quite directly to climate change. So some people say that Syria is really the first case of a major war due to climate change-induced drought. And of course, we see across Europe the refugee crisis. So these corners of the world, the high mountains where glaciers are located, may become more and more of these trouble spots.
Okay, and you've also said that the glaciers retreat have consequences for both like rich and poor countries.
Yes.
So can you also say something about why I should care about the glaciers?
The reason that people in Norway should care about glaciers is because energy is a key to Norway. Energy is the basis of the economy in a sense. Statoil is an important corporation in having both renewable, clean, green sources of energy, wind power and hydropower, while also having oil and gas that are linked immediately to greenhouse gas emissions. So if Norway wishes to promote clean energy, it's going to have to attend to its hydropower. And that means that the loss of glaciers will alter the amount of water flowing into the reservoirs, and in particular, alter the seasons. There's going to be a lot less flow of water into the reservoirs in the summer. There are some years now in Norway where reservoir levels are low by August or September. As glacier retreat advances, there'll be more years like that. The drop will be low, will start earlier, perhaps in July. That's going to affect the contracts that Norway has to export energy to Sweden, to other parts of the European grid. So that in turn means that Norway may have to slow or delay its transition from polluting energy to clean energy. I've been very fortunate to visit glaciers in Norway. I spent 3 wonderful days hiking around Hardangerjokulen, if I said that correctly. And it was beautiful to be hiking, to see the ice, to see the ptarmigans, these snowbirds that you have. And it's very hard to imagine what it would be like to hike in these areas if they were just bare rock. What would Jotunheimen be if the peaks were not white? This would be a loss. You can't just say, it's okay, we'll go to Svalbard. There'll be ice in Svalbard for a long time. You want Jotunheimen to be what it has always been, what it has been since the time of the Eddas. There's also a question of mining glaciers here in Norway, Svartisen. The line, as I understand, that separates North Norway from the rest of the country down here, has a project to mine the ice, to cut the ice from the glacier and convert it to ice cubes and sell it to wealthy individuals who like glacier ice as something to put in their whiskey. Glacier ice actually makes good ice cubes. It's very dense because it was formed under pressure, so it melts slowly. It has these tiny bubbles that are formed under pressure that pop as they melt. So if you're a wealthy person and you can afford to buy glacier ice, maybe someone should sell it to you. Or maybe it's absurd or obscene to cut pieces of Svartisen and send it around the world so that some corporation will earn some money, so that a few people up there in that remote area can get more jobs for a decade or two. This would also destabilize the glacier, perhaps a small amount, perhaps a large amount, but that's a question for you here in Norway to think what to do. It's a question that connects you to Kyrgyzstan, that connects you to Peru, where pilgrims worry about whether the glaciers are sad. It's something that connects you to my country in Washington, where people still are happy to see the tall glacier peak of Mount Rainier coming out of the clouds. So we see this beauty, we see this fragility, and above all, we see this urgency.